Okay, so my name is Christy. Today I'll be sharing how I got into Harvard Medical School. And just as a disclaimer, I want to address that everyone's journey into medicine is unique and there really is no one correct way to do it. And I just hope that through sharing my story, you can take away a few thoughts or themes that you yourself might resonate with and might help your application. Okay, so just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. This seminar is recorded. Most of this presentation will be about sort of my journey into medicine, mostly what I did throughout college. And then in the end, I will present some info about the services and packages that I offer on the Accepted Together platform. And yeah, afterwards, feel free to reach out to me after the seminar if you have any questions. So I will start with a little bit about myself. I grew up in suburban New Jersey to immigrant parents who you might imagine really value the importance of education. I was fortunate enough to attend Yale University for my undergraduate experience, and they had a BS MS program in biomedical engineering that I took full advantage of. It was a phenomenal experience. I met amazing people in college, and it was through my interest in that major that I was really inspired to pursue my interests that were centered around life sciences as well as engineering. I also wanted to focus a little bit more about the human aspects of healthcare. And so that's why I also pursued a certificate in global health and took several classes in that field and really opened my eyes into what I could do in that realm of healthcare. And then in terms of just hobbies and personal interests, I am a pretty outdoorsy person. I love to be active, whether that's rock climbing, playing squash, playing pickleball, or running. Just always finding a new way to spend some time outside with friends. So going into college, I always knew that I wanted to pursue medicine. But what really helped solidify this belief for me was a few key clinical experiences. I remember my freshman fall of college, I took this EMT class. I became certified, and then the pandemic struck. And I remember going home for spring break, and just like that, a lot of us pre-meds, we were crushed, right? Everything that we had planned for, the shadowing experiences that we had lined up, hospital volunteering, a lot of the research opportunities that I was thinking about for the summer, they just weren't available anymore. And so I was fortunate enough that I was able to lean into volunteering as an EMT. I was certified in Connecticut at the time, had to do some logistical paperwork in order to get reciprocity in New Jersey. And so I started volunteering at a local first aid squad, Springfield, New Jersey. And it was the middle of the pandemic, and I can tell you my parents were not happy about it. They obviously were worried about my safety in the middle of the pandemic, and were very concerned about that. But needless to say, I continued on with that work and gained a lot of the clinical skills at a time when EMTs really were in need. And for me, it was a great learning opportunity because it not only helped me develop like clinical skills, but it also taught me a lot about operations. And that's not something, as pre-meds we tend to think about, what are all the logistical operations that go into working as an EMT, whether that's like physically driving the ambulance to determining, which hospital is a trauma center. And those are just things you sort of learn on the job. And that was a great experience for me. Eventually, I was able to move back on campus. And by my senior year, I was chief of service of Yale Emergency Medical Services. And in that position, again, I learned a lot more stuff that was beyond the clinical care, a lot more about chain of command, knowing how to handle emergency situations, and knowing which hospitals that patients might get transported to. And these were all things you sort of pick up on the job. During my junior and senior year, again, clouded by the pandemic, EMTs were also able to give COVID-19 vaccinations in Connecticut through this emergency approval. And that was incredibly impactful for me because it gave me that opportunity to interact with patients one-on-one and address, the very real concerns they had about the vaccine. Obviously, as we continued on and gave, the second wave and third wave of vaccines, patients sort of, understood more about the vaccine. But in the very beginning, there was a lot of hesitancy around it. And, in my position, we would spend, 15 minutes just talking to patients about, their concerns, will this vaccine affect my pregnancy? What kind of side effects will I have? Does this vaccine interfere with other drugs that I'm taking? And so, that was a great experience for me in terms of clinical work. And so overall, I spoke about these clinical experiences in both my primary application and also in my secondary application, because I think it really emphasizes important traits that medical schools want, right? So leadership, accountability, teamwork, and compassion. And so if you're able to demonstrate that through stories that you can tell from just the actual patients that you've interacted with, or physicians that you've shadowed, being able to talk about you being in that position and what you learned from that experience and how that will affect you as a future physician, I think speaks a lot to how prepared you are for medical school. And I think medical school admissions can really see that. I had mentioned earlier that I majored in biomedical engineering, and I was really interested in engineering and innovation all throughout high school and college. And so I took many classes in the engineering department and had a great opportunity to learn about computer-aided engineering, 3D printing. And so what you see on the left is a CAD model of a stair chair. A stair chair is sort of this device that we use it as EMTs to transport patients up and down stairs. And so I had a lot of fun in that class, just modeling different components and parts of everything. And then in another class called Medical Devices Design, I was able to work with interventional cardiologists on this sort of small project. And we 3D printed this IV catheter. And it was basically a prototype to streamline this procedure called right heart catheterization. And that was also a great experience to sort of work with a medical professional, learn about, what are things that can be streamlined in healthcare, and what are ways that engineers can help with prototyping and innovation. And so I really enjoyed that experience. And the third photo down on the bottom right here, I served as the vice president of an organization called Yale Enable. And as an organization, we 3D print prosthetics for those in need, mostly children, adolescents. And so during COVID, our team was connected with a girl named Emily. She was 11 years old, and she was trying to learn how to play the cello. And she had, at that time, duct taped her bow onto her prosthetic and was playing with it. And it was just really uncomfortable. It was affecting her shoulder positioning. And we just thought there had to be a better way. And what you see on this Yale Engineering magazine cover is you see this 3D printed prosthetic attached to a bow adapter that my team had designed and 3D printed. And I just wanted to make clear, I take absolutely no credit in the design of this adapter, but I'm really proud to have worked with this team and have facilitated this work that we did. And, I spoke about these experiences in my medical school application, and was able to obtain letters of recommendation from the professors that I had in the engineering courses, just because engineering is really important to, my identity and, what I wanted to do in medicine. Innovation is just key to what I want to do in the future. And then I would say the last biggest part of my application was research. And I worked in a biomedical research lab that focused on a lot of things such as drug delivery. And I was incredibly lucky to have a wonderful PI and also amazing mentors that really gave me responsibility. I know sometimes it's difficult where if you're in a big lab and you don't have that um, sort of connection with your mentors or your PI, you might not be given a project that's you feel is substantial enough or whatnot. But for me, I was really lucky in that regard. I worked on two main projects in that lab over the course of 3.5 years. The first one has to do with biodegradable contraceptive implants, which don't really exist on the market today. And I'll spare you the details of the research itself. But what I do want to share with you is what I was worried about throughout this entire application process, right? So the nature of my work of designing these biodegradable implants is that you have to measure the drug that's released from these implants, both in vitro and in vivo, over several months, even years at a time. So if you're just collecting data over a year, 2 years, you can imagine I was anxious that I wouldn't have any publications or anything to show for this research that I was doing. It was something I was extremely interested in, something I was passionate about, something that was really cool, and I enjoyed doing. But I kind of felt like, I have all these friends who have these publications and I don't. And that was something that I was really concerned about. And that's exactly what happened. I applied June of my junior year and didn't have any publications on this research project that I'd worked on for over 3 years. I did have a somewhat related poster presentation at a national conference that was related to this. But by the time I applied, I hadn't even attended the conference because the conference, I think, was closer to November, I want to say. So I applied with a potential poster conference. And I did have a publication in something completely unrelated. And yeah, that was that. And at this point, for this project that I worked on for 3 full years, I will be first author, but this paper is just about to be submitted. And if and when it becomes accepted, it might be published in like 2024, a full year after I applied to medical school. And that really just speaks to the nature of, what research is. And sometimes that's just the way it is. And I think it goes to show at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, the number of publications you have under your belt, but more of what kind of skills and experiences that you have in the lab, how well you're able to speak about the work that you did. And then really important is your PI. If you've done substantial work in the lab and you decide that you want your research mentor to write a letter of recommendation for you, then they could speak more about what you've done, even if you don't have a publication. And so I was lucky in that my PI was very in tune with the work that I was doing, and he was able to write a strong letter of recommendation for me. And I think it's because of that, the fact that, yes, I may not have had publications by the time I applied, but the fact that my research mentor, my PI, wrote a really strong letter of recommendation that it was accepted to both programs in the Harvard Medical School. So if you're not familiar, there's pathways, but there's also HST, which is it's a joint program with MIT that focuses a lot more research. So I had the option to choose both. And ultimately I decided to choose pathways, which is a little bit less heavy in terms of a research focus. So that's a little bit about, my story and how what I had when I applied to medical school. And I was fortunate to get several interviews. And luckily they were all online, or else it would have been quite difficult to fly across the country. And I believe that with your cycle, you're likely going to be going through virtual interviews. Definitely in the States. I'm not too sure about Canada, but I suspect that it might be similar. And yeah, I want to emphasize that everyone's application path is unique. And oftentimes students just need a little bit of advice, guidance about, how to optimize their application and tell the story that they want to tell. And so with that, I just want to give a few pieces of advice that I would want to share with pre-medical students having gone through this very tedious but rewarding journey. The first being, you want to start early. Starting early, applying early is very beneficial for your application. If you're a junior right now, or if you're regardless of where you are in the application process, it's important to start early, brainstorm, or first find out who you want to have for your letters of recommendation. And something that I found really important was that if you want a letter from a professor or a mentor, and you won't be their student anymore. For example, if you had an amazing professor from your sophomore year, I highly recommend that you have your professor write a letter of recommendation for you after that class, after that semester, because you're still, the memory of you in their brains is still fresh in their mind, right? They still may remember you as that A student who contributed X, Y, and Z in their class, and if you ask them, then they'll be able to write you a stronger letter of recommendation. And then there are several dossier services out there. The one I used was called Interfolio, and I was basically able to store my letters of recommendation in sort of this database. And by the time that I applied in, again, June of my junior year, I was able to pay $50 and have all my letters of recommendation sent to AMCAS, which is the platform for applying to US schools. Additionally, I think it's really vital to start brainstorming key events and moments that have been really impactful in your journey to medicine. If you're a journaler, I highly recommend that you start, jotting things down. And it all comes in handy when you start writing your personal statement and you're able to draw upon these experiences that you have. For me, I started brainstorming about December of my junior year. That was when I started drafting, and March break, for spring break, I also started working on my 5th, 6th draft of my personal statement. And I went through, I want to say 7 drafts in total of my personal statement. And, the biggest difference, I would say, between my first draft and my 7th draft is the stories didn't really change. What really changed was cohesion, the cohesiveness between paragraph to paragraph to paragraph. And I think that was really key into creating this strong personal statement. Because if you think about it, medical school admission committees, they read through hundreds and hundreds and thousands of applications and personal statements. And you really want to have a strong story to tell if you want to stand out in that part. And then lastly, submit as early as possible. I submitted in June. July, honestly, is okay as well. But the idea is when you submit early, you get your secondaries early. And if you submit your secondaries early, you might get your interviews early. And all of that just increases your chances by just a little bit in the application process. The other advice I would give is to stay organized. This is one of the most important things. And the first piece of advice I'd say is create a separate email for medical school related emails, right? If you end up applying to 25, 30 medical schools, they will all be flooding your emails, and you want to make sure that you don't miss anything. And so I think that's pretty simple to do. Secondly, I would also recommend creating a spreadsheet, keeping track of the details of every single medical school. I kept track of a lot of things when it came to medical school. I had the username and password of every login thing I had. I had secondary status, interview status. I also wrote down what date I submitted secondaries, what date the interviews were, just because it kept me organized. And maybe after your interview, you want to wait 1 month before sending an update letter. Well, if you forget what day you had your interview, then it becomes a little bit confusing. And so having all the dates down allowed me to, wait for an optimal time to submit an update letter. And at the end of the day, everyone has their own sort of process. But for me, keeping a spreadsheet kept me organized. And yeah. A few more pieces of advice. Casper and Preview are sort of situational judgment exams um, that are required by some schools, but not all schools. I know the weight and timing of these exams really differ depending on what school and whether you're in Canada or in the US. But I personally believe that preparing for about 1 to 3 weeks for these situational judgment exams are sufficient. And they're really there to test your interpersonal skills, to test your behavioral tendencies in hypothetical scenarios. Um, at a certain point, medical knowledge is expected, it's given, right? That's why when it comes to the MCAT, there's sort of this like, threshold of sorts where if you pass it, great. But having the ability to interact with patients is something that is incredibly valuable in a medical setting. And so the Casper and Preview exams are just a small way for schools to sort of judge how well you're able to perform in just hypothetical situations where you might have a disagreement with other people, or for you're asked to work in a team and solve a problem. If you're applying to US schools, I would recommend taking it between your primaries and your secondaries. And I say this because there's often a period of time when you submit your primaries and you're just waiting around for the secondaries to roll in. And so there's usually a few weeks, maybe a month. For me, that was sort of late June is what I believe when I took it. But I know for Canadian schools, the Casper exam is weighted more importantly, and I believe that a lot of students take it much earlier. So definitely look into which schools you're applying to. And then lastly, after primaries and secondaries comes interviews. And I cannot stress enough the importance of mock interviews. So going through this process, whether it's with me or if your school has pre-med advisors, going through that mock interview process will give you a better grasp of not only what kind of questions and situations you might be given, but also to obtain key feedback on your answers. For example, if you might have a verbal tick, or maybe you start sounding repetitive, just having a sort of recording of how you speak sometimes is actually really incredible for helping you become better at the interview process. I will also say that good lighting and background is really important, especially if you're doing Zoom interviews. I think I invested in a $20 ring light from Amazon, and that was really helpful just to have better lighting, especially if you're in a college dorm room. Having a cheap ring light helps a lot. And lastly, I think that you should send thank you notes after your interview, just out of courtesy, but also to emphasize your interest in the school. There are some schools that say don't send any thank you notes, but I would say for the most part, I think 80% of my interviewers, I had sent a quick thank you email, and I tried to personalize it as best as I could, given what kind of conversations we had or follow-up questions I had afterwards. And it can be tedious, especially with Zoom interviews. I remember it being a pretty jam-packed day of, it would go on from 8 a.m. to maybe 4 p.m. A whole day of, hour by hour, you'd maybe have like an introduction to the school, and then you'd have a financial aid session, and then a meeting with medical students, and then your interviews scattered about during the day. And so it's a long time to stare at a screen and try to be attentive the entire time. So just a little forewarning of what virtual interviews are like. But on the flip side, it's definitely a lot easier than having to travel from place to place. So regardless of what stage you are in your pre-medical journey, feel free to look at the packages I offer. I've the general admissions counseling to anyone who just wants to chat about where they are in the medical process, and if they just want a little bit more guidance or another pair of eyes on their extracurriculars or their personal statement. actually with a personal statement, I would recommend the personal statement editing package. But I also do offer primaries and secondaries editing packages, as well as practice with the mock interviews. And again, I stress, if you don't do it with me, please do it with someone else. And so, yeah, if you're in this current cycle, you might be at a place where you want help with secondaries. It is early August, so a lot of people are finishing up or starting their secondaries right now. So I'm happy to provide this service for those who might find it helpful. And so with that QR code leads to my profile page on the Accepted Together platform. Feel free to message me on that platform if you have any questions or if you want to set up a meeting. I would love to help with any way that I can. So with that, I'm going to stop the screen recording now, and then I will open up to any questions that you might have.